Hello, everybody. Welcome to another video. Today it is the 23rd of June, and in today's video, we're going to look at the American operation that occurred last night, Midnight Hammer. That is what it's being referred to as. We're going to look at the strikes that occurred on 3 nuclear facilities, and I have the map over here showing all of Iran's nuclear associated installations, whether it be enrichment facilities, a research center, testing center, or some sort of mining facility for uranium or ore or anything of the sort. So this is a pretty cool map. And I'll leave links to all the sources I'm going to use in today's video in the description so you guys could look at the maps and at the satellite imagery for yourselves, because I do want to do a battle damage assessment of the strikes on the 3 respective facilities. But I also want to look at the bigger picture and where we go from here when it comes to the situation that is continuing to evolve between Iran, the United States, and Israel. And I want to look at the Hormuz Straits as an example of that, and more generally, the strategic approach that Israel might be taking following the strike. So let's look at the targets first of all. You had most notably the Fordow nuclear site, the fuel enrichment plant. Over here, it says between 60 to 90 meters deep, but it is almost certainly 90 meters deep. The issue is that when you have the B 2 bombers dropping those GBU 57s, also referred to as massive ordnance penetrators, those MOPs, they have a maximum penetration of 60 meters underground, and the facility itself is 90 meters underground. So naturally, each B2 that was utilized in this operation dropped two concurrently, and they both pretty much landed in the same crater, which is why when we're going to look at the satellite imagery, rather than seeing 12 craters, we're going to see 6, because in each one there was a pair that landed inside. And now the speculation is whether or not those two coupled together is enough to actually penetrate 90 meters deep and cause significant damage to the tunnels, the hardened concrete tunnels that are sort of built in building the perimeter of the facility. So over here in Fordow, you had essentially 6 B2s utilized, each one dropping 2, as I said. Then you had in Natanz, you had one B2 drop 2 of those GBU 57s. And in Isfahan, you had 30 Tomahawks that were launched by American submarines nearby, and they caused damage primarily to the above ground facilities. I think that they destroyed 19 new buildings because previously Isfahan had been targeted by the Israeli side. And same thing with Natanz. Natanz, their over ground facilities were targeted twice in Israeli strikes. And one time during the first attack, the actual centrifuges were still on, apparently, and the power was still on. And so the Israelis struck and caused significant damage to the power facilities and the generation. And so the centrifuges actually suffered more significant damage as a result of the shockwave in that scenario. And perhaps the cylinders could have gotten severely damaged in that opening strike. But now, once again, we're seeing the United States target this same location. And it appears that what we'll see in the satellite imagery is that the United States targeted the underground portion of the nuclear facility, because the above ground areas had already been struck pretty heavily by the Israeli side, causing it to be rendered pretty much inoperable. But the underground site, even though here it claims that it's about 8 meters deep, it could be even deeper than that. Nonetheless, it was targeted by those two GBU 57s from the US side. So that is a recap of 3 locations. But Iran does have other associated nuclear installations. You have the Arak heavy water production plant, although it's not necessarily operable now, especially after the Israeli strike that occurred on it earlier this week. So that was one location. In Bushehr, you have a nuclear power plant, and it is actually pretty close to the Persian Gulf, which is why there's a lot of concern about the sort of radiation spillover that could go into the Gulf, into the associated Gulf states. And so that's been a large topic of conversation recently. But for now, it's not necessarily been targeted by either side. It still is standing firm. And you have a couple of other uranium ore concentrate facilities and milling facilities, mining facilities as well. You can see them over here on the map, largely located in the center west of the country, spanning from the north around the Caspian Sea all the way south to the Persian Gulf. So there is a sort of pattern when we see the locations of all this. And a lot of these facilities are also based around Tehran. In Tehran, you have a lot of the research sites. You also have some associated military locations. So the Parchin military complex is used for production of ballistic missiles on one hand, but it is also an area where there may be some sort of weaponization site and an underground facility for production of uranium and metal nuclear weapons, of course. Although here they're saying that this is something that was uh, in operation in the past, in that it's currently dormant. So we're not exactly sure, but we do know that the IDF, they've been claiming that their Air Force struck numerous research production facilities, and they gave the geolocations all across the city of Tehran. But in terms of enrichment, which is really the main focus of the conversation, then you have to look at Natanz, which is the largest enrichment facility, and Fordow, which is the most important one with the most advanced centrifuges. You have, I believe it's referred to as IR1s, and so those are the oldest centrifuges at Iran's disposal. So part of the Fordow Hall actually does include those, but then the other section includes IR6s, and those are much more up to date and modern. So that should give you guys an idea of those locations. But one other thing that has to be noted is that the Iranians, since at least last year, have been working on an additional enrichment facility, which is actually located even deeper than Fordow. So Natanz is over here. There's a mountain range just south of it, and the enrichment facility over there is going to be called Pickaxe. I don't think it's complete yet. There isn't any information about, the centrifuges actually running over there and movement of uranium, at least that we know of. But it would serve as a likely candidate for a location that the uranium stockpiles that were located in Fordow could have been relocated towards, because obviously we all had an anticipation that there would be an American attack. And so certainly there could have been an incentive from the Iranian side to move whatever they could without being spotted, or just doing so within the necessary time frame to this underground facility, which is not complete yet. So there's not really running yet of enrichment or anything of the sort, but that's the plan, to eventually have that as a new alternative. And that's going to become even more important now that, there's significant damage incurred to Fordow and to Natanz. And so you could have this as a viable option for really serving as the building blocks for an Iranian attempt at rebuilding their nuclear program. And therefore, it makes it an opportune target for the Americans and Israelis in a second round of attacks on nuclear facilities. Because again, despite the significant damage that we're going to see, definitely there has been a level of Iran's facilities, or specifically their uranium that's enriched at 60%, that has survived. This has been admitted by Israeli sources as well. Netanyahu himself actually said that he has intelligence about the whereabouts of 400 kilograms of 60% uranium enrichment. And so he wasn't really able to get into the details about what he means by that. But it seems as if the Iranians had those stockpiles stored for the most part in Natanz and Fordow, and then they started moving them out whatever they could. Definitely at that point, the Israelis, with their ISR and with the American support from their own satellites, would have been able to track the movement of those stockpiles into new underground facilities. And there are a lot of candidates, like we said, south of Natanz, for instance, but it could be various other areas. You have the Zagros Mountains, in the southeastern part of the Zagros Mountains, located over here in the south, is home to a bunch of ballistic missile cities and a bunch of extraction facilities. So that's a plausible candidate. You also have the Alborz mountain range, and particularly the eastern part of the range, an area that's a bit farther away from Israeli reach. Also very deep when it comes to the actual mountains and their altitude. So that's another potential area where you could see small scale movement. And then there's the question of how many centrifuges have been able to survive. First of all, how many were not destroyed in the actual American strikes, but actually were able to survive despite being underground in Fordow and such. Because if there were centrifuges in Natanz that were still operating after the Israeli strikes, then after the American strikes, the likelihood becomes pretty low. But in regards to Fordow, there's always the question of, first of all, whether they actually did incur severe damage during the American strike, and two, whether some of the centrifuges were actually moved out before the strike. And that's an open-ended question. And I would say that there's no proof yet to back up that claim that centrifuges were moved out for Fordow. Certainly that would be interesting. And then the candidate would be for it to be moved to the Pickaxe facility, but we don't know of anything of the sorts. And we'll get into the satellite imagery of the pickup, or of the dumpster trucks that were in Fordow, which is a couple of days before the actual American strike. But hopefully that serves as a pretty good background. And now I want to just do a summary of the satellite imagery, if you guys like that. And I want to show you guys the layouts of the nuclear facilities. So once again, here you can see a map that came out of the Pentagon, and they show how there were these 6 B-2s that were involved in the attack on Fordow over here. Then one of them was involved in the attack on Natanz, and then the submarines operating here. I think that's the Gulf of Oman. They fired all the way into Isfahan. Accompanying the B-2s, you had these F-22s as well, and various other fourth and fifth generation fighters. In total, you had the involvement of 125, or even more than that, perhaps, aircraft, whether they be those fourth, fifth generation aircraft or refuelers, because you had the KC 46 or the KC 135, and they played a huge role in just continually refueling the B 2s as they flew really halfway across the world, and did that for 18 hours and then did another 18 hours back to Missouri. Another interesting thing that happened was you had the day before the strikes, I believe it was, 6 B-2s that were launched from California and really crossed over the Pacific. They had refueling done to them right after takeoff, and their transponders were on. So everybody in the OSINT community saw that they were active and they saw their flight path. And that served as a diversion that's really take attention away from these 7 that were involved in the actual attack, whereas the other 6, they were not utilized in the attack and they landed in Guam, to my knowledge. So that was a part of the diversionary measure conducted by the American side to catch the Iranians off guard. I do want to show you guys a video showing the inside of Fordow. Yeah, so here you guys can see the inside of the facility. You can see that this is the outer perimeter. You can see the ridge line. And then directly under that ridge line, you have the tunnel components, including the main hall with all of the centrifuges. You have the storage containers, and as you guys can see, the IR1 and the IR6, as I was referring to, the backup power supply, and you have control room, as it says over here. And I'll link this video in the description, but it's just a animation, and there are blueprints actually that I can show you guys. And this is the general makeup of the facility. The strikes themselves, they didn't occur directly on the cascades from what we know, and I'll show you guys some proof of that as well. But they occurred basically through a ventilation shaft. And that makes sense because the ventilation shaft would be the easiest area to penetrate. And it's basically directly in this hallway in between the backup power supply and the cascades. And so that's one area where you had penetrations. So here's a really good illustration of the overground facility in Fordow. You guys can see over here the ventilation system. You could see the exact locations, and you could also see the satellite imagery from today indicating that there were 6 entry holes. And because 12 GBUs were utilized in total, uh, there were 6 impact points. So essentially, from each B2, they dropped 2 munitions, and the 2 munitions they entered into the same crater, and that's why we see 6. And that also is reflective of a significant amount of accuracy with these strikes. And you can see how they were very specifically pinpointed to target the ventilation areas in order to actually have the highest chance of infiltrating and perhaps to steelman the hopes of the American side to sort of force the tunnels to cave in on themselves and collapse. So you guys can see the general location of them over here on the ridgeline as well. You guys can also see the tunnel entrances through which the various operators over here would try to get in. But in the days before the strike, they tried to basically cover it up with these pieces of rubble and soil and sand and such. And there's also footage of that. And that's all in an attempt to soften the blow from the American strike. And I didn't mention this, but all in all, you had the utilization of 75 precision guided munitions. And of those, as we said before, 14 were those GBUs, the penetrator bombs, the MOPs, as well as 30 that were the Tomahawks. And so the other ones probably could have been launched from the F-22s, perhaps in an attempt to conduct preemptive air defense suppression of nearby sites, because there is actually a nearby air defense site that accompanies Fordow, although they did not fire anything at the American sortie in this case. Here you guys can get another blueprint of the Fordow facility. And once again, the main Cascade Hall. This is where you have all those centrifuges that are so widely kept track of. And so here you have the service and supports hall and the ventilation structure, basically just reflecting what we saw before in the animation. So here we have close-ups of the ventilation shafts showing their quadrilateral shape all the way back from 2009. Also lending credence to the sort of rationale behind targeting itself. Here you could also see those three craters that occurred around it. Also over here, you can see the other three craters that occurred around the other section of the ventilation shaft. Here as well, you can see based on the estimates of the above ground impacts, we can get sort of some sort of surmission of where you have the locations within the underground facility. And as we said before, this hallway over here between the cascades and the backup power supply, that's probably around where it hits. So they're not directly the centrifuges. And the six ones are over here. And those are the most advanced ones. You also had over here near the control room, three of those impacts. So you could see more generally, there wasn't really an attempt to target the tunnel entrances and the corridors leading up into the key areas. But the hope from the American perspective would be that the entire blast would lead to a sort of ripple effect that would cause the tunnels to cave in on themselves in order to deny access to any sort of Iranian rescue team. But we'll have to see if that ends up happening because there hasn't been enough time yet, based on what we know, for the Iranian workers over here and for whatever engineers they have involved to go in and assess the damage. But ultimately, the Iranians will eventually be able to do that sort of battle damage assessment because they have access to the site. Now, it's another question whether the United States and Israel decide that it's necessary to conduct this sort of strike again in order to directly target the centrifuges over here to make sure, like with complete certainty, that they were destroyed and not just that the nearby facilities were severely damaged. So, that's another thing that has to be taken into consideration. But over here, once again, you see the three red dots. It's pretty close to the depleted uranium storage, which could be used for conventional munitions. In whatever case, you have the UF6 over here, a container, and the backup generators. As many people are pointing out, you have these 16 trucks. And when you zoom in, you sort of understand that those behind areas, the bed of those trucks, those are open, meaning that it's probably carrying earthen material in order to drop in to the entrances over here, you can see. And later on in satellite imagery that came out over the couple of days after this was recorded on June 19th, you did see that this entrance was covered up. And so I don't necessarily think that these exact trucks were used to carry out centrifuges or even uranium stockpiles. I think it's much more likely that they were just involved in this engineering work. And perhaps there was some other movement that occurred earlier on. Some Iranian sources talk about movement back in March in anticipation of this. We can't really say for certain yet because we don't have any sort of independent corroboration of it. And over here, you can see that those tunnel entrances were sealed with dirt. You can see it over here very clearly that there was no more sort of opening that we previously saw in the other imagery. Same thing over here. And once again, high resolution photos of the impacts. Now, to move on to Natanz, you can see that the Israelis targeted it twice and they focused on some key locations above ground and they reported on this. And obviously, the satellite imagery also shows the same exact thing. You can see that they targeted the electrical transformer. So, again, going for the power and the control building over here, they really tried to really inflict damage onto the underground area as well because there are two stories of underground enrichment halls with centrifuges, electrical rooms, and all of the support infrastructure. So those areas were targeted in those two rounds of strikes, but the Americans doubled down on it with those two GBUs. So here we get a really clear view of the penetration. And it's directly in the area that I showed you guys before, marked in red, that is supposed to be the area directly above the underground area. So the underground area sort of spans this location over here, and it's where the centrifuges are. You could see how a 5.5 meter diameter munition had its sort of entry around here, and there's very clear a crater in this specific location. There's also another crater that occurred a bit to the northwest, which is also within the confines of the same underground facility. So that was once again the American target, just completely destroy and ensure that the centrifuges and whatever sort of uranium stockpile was also located over there would just be completely wiped off. So Here you can get an even clearer view of that crater, and perhaps there are already Iranian efforts underway to try to begin to fill up the holes over here with the intention of just creating a more solid base to prevent further strikes on this location. That's going to be of the utmost priority for the Iranian employees in this area. Now, to move on to Isfahan, you can see over here, this was a video that was released by somebody near the facility, and we actually get a pretty clear view of the strike in comparison to the Natanz and Fordow areas where we really didn't see anything because they were a bit more isolated. But over here in Isfahan, we actually did get a view of the explosions from afar based on this recording. So that should give you guys an idea of just what it felt like over there. But again, everything that occurred in Isfahan was above ground with the tomahawks. You can see this is the proof for the geolocation. So really amazing work. So here you have a breakdown of the Isfahan nuclear facility. This is a reconversion of enriched uranium, and this is where it's carried out. And Fox News claims that it's an area where it's used to produce nuclear weapons. We have no idea of that. I can't say either way in that regard. The IAEA inspectors, they say that it's also storage for UF6. So that's what you need to put into the centrifuges to separate between uranium 235 and 238. So that's extremely important for the Americans and Israelis to have destroyed. And there probably is also a tunnel facility over here, but I'm sort of skeptical about how deep it is. Here they claim that it's deep underground and under hard rock, but they can't really say that for sure. So there's a facility for producing metallic uranium. You have these testing labs, and you have the conversion of enriched uranium. So that's just the above ground area. Here we have really high resolution imagery from before the strikes by the Americans, although I believe this is dated to June 16th. So that would be really during the Israeli round of attacks. But here you can see some of the damage that was incurred due to the combined efforts of the Israelis first with their round of strikes, and then later on the American strikes. So you could see how this is zoomed in, and a lot of those structures were just significantly damaged in certain locations, and others, like over here, they're almost completely flattened. And then you have other buildings that were not touched much at all. And over here, you have another zoom in. You could see how there was significant damage caused to the roofs of some of these buildings. And we don't know what's going on inside. That's really the most important question. What sort of damage was caused to the internal parts of these facilities? And here, once again, we have a close up on the damage that was caused specifically by the tomahawks, not by the Israelis. So you can see that we have 4 particular locations that incurred the most damage in that regard. Over here, you have that in the first photo. This house suffered damage. This one did as well. These warehouses did as well. So that's in addition to the original damage caused by the Israelis. So all in all, the takeaway is that we don't have a clear understanding of the full extent of damage because we can't get an idea of what's going on underground in Fordow, even underground in Natanz to a certain degree. But the sort of consensus would be that in Natanz in particular, it is completely destroyed. That's been sort of a repeated thing in Israeli media over the past couple of hours, that they are pretty much certain of the destruction of Natanz, although they're not exactly sure about Isfahan, which does make sense because the GBU 57s were not used on Isfahan, so we don't know if the Tomahawks actually had the ability to infiltrate into whatever underground facilities are also located in this area. So that's an open question mark, but I would say the most ambiguous of all would be Fordow, because there's a question of whether it actually was able to penetrate that deep, or whether once it did penetrate, it did cause the desired results of complete destruction. According to the New York Times and according to 2 Israeli security sources that were spoken to, they say that there was severe damage inflicted, extremely high cost, but that it was not completely destroyed. So there is a difference, meaning that there could be an attempt to go in and collect some of the pieces, collect whatever remains, and then begin from scratch. And honestly, it's not really beginning from scratch that much because, as I said before, the Iranians, a lot of their uranium that was enriched at 60% was not located in these facilities. Some of it was unaccounted for. And apparently Israel knows where it's located. That's sort of the rumor going around, and I can't confirm that. But if it is, then if they know where it is, then I would expect them to strike it in the near future, because one of Israel's main strategic objectives with their strikes over here is to denuclearize And when I say that, I mean remove the threat from the nuclear program. And not necessarily nuclear tipped weapons or anything of the sort, but just the threats of enrichment, especially at 60%, because then the fear is that you could very quickly arrive at 90% from 60%. So there's an open-ended question about where some of that 400 kilograms worth of 60% uranium is, whether the Iranians were able to move it out, or whether it is in Fordow but was not destroyed. Those are all legitimate questions. Same thing for some of the centrifuges. And then more generally, you have all of the associated facilities that were not destroyed. You have Bushehr, you have the uranium mines that could be used if they actually had to start over. You have all the scientists that were not assassinated. I know 17 nuclear scientists were killed so far, but you're looking at hundreds that are involved in like the core operations, in addition to thousands of workers in these facilities. So 17 is important because those 17 were probably at the sort of higher end of the planning, but it's not enough to completely stymie the command and control. And you're looking at the blueprints for production still probably being accessible if the Iranians decide to utilize that in the future. So I would say, regardless of those nuances, the fact that there was at least significant damage incurred to those three facilities definitely did push back any attempted production if it was being attempted. And even if it wasn't, it did cause a lot of damage to Iran's enrichment capabilities, going on to 60% and above. And in the coming days, the United States and Israel will complete their intelligence assessment, and they will be able to get a clear picture of whether the program actually does have now an ability of sort of rebounding, albeit at a much slower pace and with much more damage caused. That's going to be a question that they have to answer. And depending on that, they could conduct another round of strikes. At the same time, though, there's the question of how Iran will retaliate for a direct American offensive attack on their territory, because up until now, it was just American defensive support for Israel by intercepting the missiles and providing intelligence, which could actually be argued as an offensive capacity as well. But in terms of a direct strike, utilizing B-2s, the second largest sort of round or flight of B-2s in recorded history, only second to the 9/11 era. And so that sort of attack really does raise the concerns within the United States, within the military bases, within all the Gulf states, of potential retaliation, both on the Strait of Hormuz, where at its narrowest, it's 33 kilometers in between Iran and Oman in this particular location, I believe. And, there's also the situation with striking American military bases. That has not happened yet, and there hasn't been an indication of it happening yet. Although a bunch of embassies are being evacuated in Bahrain, most of the workers are, working from home at the moment. And the Iranian parliament did recommend closing the Strait of Hormuz and mining it, but it's only a recommendation. They don't really have that official authority. Ultimately, that rests within the National Security Council. So we'll see what they say over the coming days, because that's going to play a big role in how this escalates or doesn't escalate. Because the American messaging is that they succeeded in this, or if they almost did, and that they have a very specific goal in targeting the nuclear program, and they're sort of trying to give the Iranians sort of lifeline without any attempt at regime change to sort of come back to negotiations and accept worse conditions than were probably proposed to them during the initial rounds of talks in Oman that occurred earlier, maybe in May, in the previous months. So that's probably the American angle on all this. And from the Israeli perspective, they are trying to avoid a war of attrition with Iran because of issues with their interceptors, which could eventually lead to more leakages of ballistic missiles, even if the amount of ballistic missiles being launched in each barrage is, between 20 to 30. Over time, the amount of impacts, the percentage of impacts as a whole compared to the entire barrage, will begin to increase. We've already seen that happen. And so then it becomes a numbers game between the amount of ballistic missile launchers, TELs, that the Iranians have, the amount of medium range BMs that can actually reach into Israeli territory. And that would have to be juxtaposed to the amount of interceptors that the Israelis have within their systems, like David Sling or Arrow 2 or 3, Patriot Pack 3, or the American protection from the THAAD, or from naval side, the SM3s and SM6s. Those are like the main layers. And so it's multifaceted. which is a part of why it's been able to intercept so many of the ballistic missiles so far, which really can't be said as much for the American bases. They don't have the same level of layered protection, and they're closer, which means that they are more vulnerable to targets. But so far, there hasn't been an effort by Iran to launch any attacks on them, and there are about 40,000 American personnel within the range of some of those Iranian ballistic missiles, especially along the southern coast of the country. So certainly something to keep an eye on. But that sort of attack by the Iranians, whether it be mining the Straits of Hormuz or targeting any sort of American military assets, would invite the United States to conduct even more retaliatory attacks. And at that point, regime change would be on the board. And from an Israeli perspective, they are actually willing to, within the next couple of weeks, end their operations due to this attritional fatigue that I did mention, and due to them sort of running down their target list. And then in exchange, they would just hope that the Iranians, agree to some sort of deal. But even that may not be fully needed if Israel feels that it's sufficiently targeted the nuclear program. The most important thing would be that the Iranians would stop targeting Israel with ballistic missiles, and then there would be a ceasefire, sort of, you know, unspoken agreement on a ceasefire, because the Israelis would just stop their air sorties and the Iranians would start launching ballistic missiles. That's something that the Israelis are seriously pondering. They're seriously considering that possibility now within the next week or a bit more than that. But for the time being, they're going to continue striking as much as they can from Iranian military installations, which you can see over here on the map. And then, if that does not work and Iran insists on continuing to launch missiles towards Israel, then that's when the regime change operation is going to come into full force. That's my understanding of the situation. That's not the official line, but it could turn into that very quickly, especially after what Trump tweeted recently about making Iran great again and talking about the potential for regime change. And obviously, that's meant to pressure Iran, but there's also a kernel of truth that it could be something pursued by the Israelis and even by the Americans in tandem, to try to take out the supreme leader, to try to take out his three successors that were selected already, to take out the Besiege, which is the internal security of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps, to take out police headquarters. That would be the sort of escalatory, sort of worst case scenario for the Iranian side. But the other, a less bombastic scenario, which is also certainly very possible, is that eventually there's a lull in the fighting and a sort of gentleman's agreement, and the fighting just sort of dies down at that point, and then perhaps there is some sort of deal, but that's not even necessary to a certain degree. So that's the bigger strategic outlook. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.